Go ahead. 20 days are right.
Okay. Okay. Let's get started. So a couple weeks ago, a bunch of us had the opportunity to go to Conf. So that is what we are talking about today. Just the different things we learned there. So we are going to go, each one of us are going to talk about a little piece. I'm talking about Angular 6, which is now out and in the wild. It was pretty funny. During, I think it was the first day, one of the keynotes, they were talking, it was Brad Green, one of the main Angular guys, he said, Angular 6 is dangerously close to coming out. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. I was like this giddy little kid, super excited for Angular 6. And so he talked about a whole bunch of stuff. There's a lot of new things in Angular 6. I want to talk about two main things. The first thing I want to talk about that's new with Angular 6 is that they have unified the version numbers between the CLI and the actual Angular library. I don't know about you guys, but when I was using Angular, I'd be looking at the CLI and I'd be on version 1.7.4 or whatever, but I'd be running Angular 5. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, how do I know that this CLI matches up? And there's, you could go out and track it down and stuff, but I got really sick of getting errors saying, but this CLI doesn't match this version of Angular. So with Angular 6, they've actually matched the version numbers. They've actually made the CLI catch up. And so from going forward, the versions will match with each release. And while that's maybe not a big deal, I was actually super excited about it. So excited, in fact, that I started watching the Angular Git repository for commits, and I'd watch the builds go out to NPM, and they pushed, I think it was like 11 different RC candidates for Angular 6 before they finally pushed it out to production. And that night, I was ready to jump on it. So I was really, really excited, in case you guys can't tell, that they actually have one big unified version number. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to talk about is ng update. I thought ng update was super cool. What it is it updates your application dependencies when it's time to update your packages. So, if you need a new version of the Angular library or the like maybe RxJS, new versions come out and they get published up to NPM, and then you use NPM to get your updates. Well, I ended up installing another tool that would check for updates, and then you would tell it to go install the updates. ng update is rolled into the Angular CLI. So now on the command line, you just you go to your website folder, you say ng update, and it will just update all your package or your application dependencies. I thought it was super cool. They point out that it does it better than just going through regular NPM, because ng update is actually more familiar with the structure of an Angular application. And so it can actually run the update better. It does use NPM or Yarn as a the foundational tool for that functionality, but it just, in my opinion, it's better. And then the thing that I thought was super cool was that last bullet point, that it'll apply library transforms to help with compatibility issues. So if it installs a new library, a new version number, and there could be breaking changes in there, that team can publish a library. Are we okay? Okay. That team can publish a library that will help with backwards compatibility, and it will apply that transform or that compatibility package to your project so that it remains backwards compatible or forward compatible, depending on how you want to think of it. So I was super excited about that. I tried it out, and it worked pretty good. I think they have a few things to work out with the ng update still. So I took a couple screenshots as I was doing this a few days ago, just to see, just so I could show you guys what it does. So, you go out to the command line, you run ng update, and what it'll do is it'll say, oh, look, you have a version that's out of date. I had already updated my application to Angular 6, but it says, oh, hey, look, you are running Angular 6, but 6.1, in this case 6.1 and 6.2, are both out. And so it says, hey, these are updates you could run. To actually run the update, you need to run this command, ng update all, or you can actually run each individual package as well. But I wanted to do all because I didn't want to type in all the different packages to update. The one little hiccup I ran into this when I was going through this process was that it hated my TypeScript version, which I thought was a little wonky. So to get around it, it actually wouldn't run the update. To get around it, I found a Git ticket, or a GitHub ticket for that issue, where people said, oh, just do force right here. That's when NPM cusses at you and says, oh, I really hope you know what you're doing. But it worked. So, just do ng update /all. It'll update all your dependencies. Force it, and it will just run through. So I cut out some of the stuff here so I could actually show you can see the whole thing. But it says, hey, look, we're going to update your CLI. We're going to update Angular HTTP, CLI router. It updates your package.json, and then it says, hey, 113 packages updated from these contributors. It removed a few packages, moved a few things around, warns you about vulnerabilities, and then you're done. It was actually very straightforward to update my application to the latest version of Angular and all the dependencies that I had. So that's ng update. Let me go back a couple slides. Right here, this link out on Angular.io has all of the latest stuff that came out with Angular 6. So if you guys want to go read about it, that is a really good resource. Yeah. Any questions about Angular 6? That stuff we talked about? Okay. As a side note, I came away from this conference with a whole bunch of pins and stickers, just obnoxious conference swag that I didn't want to keep. And I didn't want to throw it away because that'd be horrible. So you guys can have some. I got ng-comp stickers. I got an Angular pin if you guys want. This is a little wallet card holder thing you put on the back of your phone. So I'll just put them here on this table, and it's a free for all. Okay.
Talking about some of the updates to Angular Material, which is the component library that's built by Google, not necessarily the Angular team. There were two main things they talked about was the component development kit, or the CDK, and schematics. So we'll start with the CDK. The CDK is basically just a set of predefined behaviors, right? So there's code to drive a bunch of UI behaviors. So accessibility, bidirectionality, which basically means right to left or left to right text. Some layout, observers, overlay, portal, and scrolling. Those are the ones that are listed on the website right now. There's a few bare bones components. One's called Stepper, which is kind of a wizard thing. The introduction wizards that you get where you, hey, do this now. Oh, look over here. So there's that kind of stuff. There's a table and then a tree component. They talked quite a bit about their tree component. I'm not going to talk about it here, but you can find the videos and go through it and show how you can wire it up and have a collapsing tree structure with it. Those are the ones that are documented on the site. There's an accordion and a text field in the repo. I don't know if that means that the site just hasn't caught up yet, or those two aren't ready for prime time. There's no real way to know. So there's documentation at material.angular.io. It's got an API reference, examples of use. Again, maybe it's incomplete. My experience with the documentation on Material has been it covers the basics pretty well. But once you get outside of the realm of their little examples that they have, then you're kind of on your own. Trial and error or lots of Googling to try and figure stuff out. And if you're really adventurous, you can dig into the Material 2 repo and see how Material is using the CDK. So the idea behind the CDK is now there's this foundation for you to be able to build your own component library. Maybe you're at a client who has some really strict design guidelines that the existing component libraries don't match well with, and maybe they want you to write your own component library. So the idea is that you could use the CDK, which is very bare bones, very non-opinionated about how things should look, to do that. But you can get into the Material 2 library and see how they're using the CDK to build Material 2. Schematics. If you've not heard of schematics yet, that was something I think they added in 5, which is basically a way to extend the CLI. So with ng, you have the ng generate command, which will build out a component. What schematics will let you do is write your own generate commands so that you can add things to the CLI for your particular library, or maybe you don't like the way Angular defaults the components. You can customize that with schematics. So Material 6 includes some CLI commands to scaffold some basic app components. If you've not worked with Material yet, the HTML could be kind of verbose. And so having something to simplify that for you is actually pretty cool. That was kind of what caught my eye when we were going through that. So the first thing you do is obviously you install Angular. So install the CLI if you don't, and then you can just do ng new brown bag or whatever your project name is, and then it'll kind of scaffold out your library for you. Then you install Material and the CDK. A side note, it does install 6.0.2, even though the site still says there on RC14. So that's another thing that makes me wonder how far behind is the documentation to what's really out there. And then you do ng add material. Okay, so what that does is it'll make a bunch of changes. You can kind of see the diff up there of all the files that it changed. So in your index, it adds links to the icon font and the Roboto font, which is Material's default font. In your app module, and then it adds the animations module to support the animations that Material uses. And then in Angular, in your JSON file, your angular.json, which is kind of your config for the CLI. So when you run your build and your start and all that other stuff, it includes the style sheets that you will use for Material. So just to get Material running, those are the things you have to do just out of the box, and it does all that for you. So the examples that he gave during his little presentation was he did this ng generate the Material Nav, and he gave it the name of main nav. And so what that ended up doing So in your module file, it imports all of the modules that navigation module is going to use. It includes the import statements, adds the declarations. You can see here the HTML of the component that it built for you. And that's what you have when it's done. You don't have to do anything, and you've already got a side menu which is responsive and collapsing. You have content area, your title. Obviously, you can go in and change all that if you need to, right? But at least you have the basic framework to start with. The next thing he did was the ng generate material dashboard. And again, now you've got some, card components that you can work with however you want. Again, it's something you will eventually modify, but at least you have something to start with without having to try and figure it all out yourself. The one thing that the generate commands don't do, obviously, because you still have to go into your app.component .html file and put in the main nav HTML tag, right? And in this case, you have to go into your main nav content area and add your dashboard component tag. But that's certainly much easier than having to do adding all of that. Right? Because even if you do an ng generate to create the component, you don't have any of the HTML there, which is already, you can see it's got the attribute role stuff, which is for ARIA. So it's already accessible. It's already ready to go for you. I think that was it. All right, thanks.
Hi, my name is Josh Porter. I'm another team lead on the scripting practice. I want to talk to you a little bit about CSS Grid. I think with the new Angular 6 UI and components, they're definitely going down the grid layout. So Rachel Andrew says the difference between Flexbox and CSS Grid. Flexbox is a one-dimensional, so that you lay out your component and it wraps, right? Whereas Grid is a two-dimensional way of laying things out, so that you can have template grid areas, and I'll go into that. So they did a talk at the Indie Conf. Here's the link. You can watch it. So a few things to go over. He goes over there's new terminology. If you're familiar with Flexbox, Grid has new properties. So one is the grid lines. Over on the left, each line is defined. So row line 1, and then call line 1, and call line 2, and row line 2, etc. So you can lay out your boxes and define them by that as well, or you can do it by grid cell or grid track. So some examples. He does a video tutorial with a Git repo to, if you've ever played Zelda Breath in the Wild, he builds out the grid using CSS Grid, and with he goes in to explain, like, he sees grid elements everywhere he looks, like his wife's makeup. And there's the code that you can go to. He goes in to another example, and you can build that out. The reasons I like grid, there's no more responsive left to right and stacked on top. You can pick and choose where the elements land. So if you have a left nav, you can place it at the bottom on mobile and have your main content be the focus on mobile or tablet. And you can rearrange it just by media queries. There's a lot more to CSS Grid. I've done another brand brag just on that. And if you want, you can come ask me. I've been doing Grid for about 6 months now on my own, and have a lot of testing or have done a lot of testing. So yeah, I think that's it for me. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about Angular elements. Basically, they're a new bit of functionality that came out with Angular 6. To kind of go over what they do, we'll start by talking about custom elements. So is everybody here familiar with custom elements? It's kind of it's a new feature in HTML where basically if you've worked with like any of the HTML5 inputs like color or date, you get an input field, but when you click on it, something else pops up, a calendar or a color picker or something like that. Those are all defined by the browser manufacturers. And now they're starting to add the ability to let developers create their own custom HTML elements. So basically you just put in a tag and it will have some functionality hidden behind it. And so Angular Elements is kind of marrying the two. So to give kind of a refresher on how you would go about creating custom elements, basically all you're doing is creating an ES6 class. It extends HTML element. So this would just give you a tag of hello world. It doesn't do anything. You can add, they have lifecycle hooks, so you can add callbacks to them when the element is created, when it's destroyed. So if you needed to set up any kind of listeners, kind of standard boilerplate stuff. You can add custom events to them. So if you wanted to add a click handler, you can absolutely do that. So in this instance, if you were to click on this hello world tag, it will actually emit a custom event called name change. Don't worry too much about this. This is just kind of to give a overview of what a custom element looks like using the existing browser APIs. So now we're going to talk about how Angular Elements combines that with Angular code that you're hopefully used to writing at this point. So here's just kind of a standard Angular component. It's got the same name, hello world. It's got an input tag, and it just displays whatever a user types in that input in the H1. You click the button to actually update the name that's displayed. And here we can see how we would go about registering it. So this is just still standard Angular stuff. So all we're doing is declaring the component that we just created so that the module is aware of it. You'll notice we're not using the bootstrap tag or the bootstrap key. So that's what basically tells Angular that that's the entry point of your application. We're just saying that you can use hello world anywhere outside of Angular. And then you'll notice we're using the ng-do bootstrap callback. That's basically what you would do to what we'll use to register these elements as native browser elements. So this, has anyone here looked at the main TS file on an Angular application before? If you have, this is going to look really familiar. Basically, it's just bootstrapping your module and starting your application. But Bootstrap module actually returns a promise, and so you can work with it and get a reference to your module. So that's basically the entire Angular application, all packaged up, ready to go. And so this is what we can use to actually register these custom elements. So you can see we're pulling in create custom element. That's the only function that's in the Angular elements library. And that's what does the kind of hooking up of the Angular component that you created with an element. And you'll notice we're passing in the injector, so that's where it gets pretty exciting. I'll just put that one out there. We'll get to it in a moment. So now we've got this custom element, and we register it just like we did back a few slides ago when I told you not to pay attention. Probably should have, but trust me, I used that line before. So yeah, all that's going on right here is we've created an Angular component just as you always would, and now we're registering it as this custom element so it can be used outside of an Angular context. There's an alternative way of actually registering these, so if you don't want to mess with your main TS file, that's why we got this ngdo bootstrap lifecycle hook. And so they're basically doing the exact same thing. They're both doing custom elements.define, whatever. You can just do it in your module if you prefer. This is kind of the cleaner way. So, and so now if you want to use it, you just throw that in your HTML anywhere, as long as you're importing the JavaScript, and it will just work. So it doesn't need to be contained within an Angular application. You can even create them imperatively. So if you needed to dynamically create DOM nodes, you would do it using the same DOM functions that you're familiar with. If you're using jQuery, you can use jQuery to create these because for all intents and purposes, they are just HTML tags like a div or a span. So yeah, here we're creating the element and appending it to the body, and we're setting the name property on it. So at this point, the hello world variable is basically the component, the class that we created in Angular. So any public properties can be accessed through it. Or if you prefer, you can just set the name as an attribute, just like any other attribute on an HTML tag. You can add event listeners. So if you recall, we had a name change event. It was that custom event that we created. And so when you click that button, it emits an event that's just custom for this element, and you can do with it as you please. So now we get around to why we grabbed the injector. Dependency injection actually works with Angular elements. So that's where it gets pretty cool. So you can have multiple elements sprinkled throughout a page, and they're all able to talk to each other through services, just the way that you're used to doing beforehand. But again, you don't need to use Angular for it. You just throw these elements on the page. Yeah, so that's a big drawing point of using Angular is its dependency injection. And so you still get that here. So yeah, you can see again, we're pulling in the injector and passing it to that create custom element. So that way each component knows what the injector is, so they can get access to all of the services that have been registered inside of it. So the reason you have to do it that way is you can't pass an injector here. You've just got a tag. There's no way to kind of add functionality to this. So the element needs to be aware of what services are available when it's created. Likewise, if you're doing a document.create element, again, this doesn't allow for additional arguments to hook up Angular because this is just browser specific. It doesn't know what Angular is and frankly doesn't care. And so that's kind of why you've got to, that's why it's done this way. They're hoping to make it simpler to create custom elements, but this is kind of the version 1 approach. So content projection. Are you guys familiar with transclusion from AngularJS? If you're not, basically what it means is you can just put ng content somewhere in your template HTML, and then what that does is any child content of your tag will go wherever you specify ng content. So for example, if we were to put this inside of our template with span some content, it comes out looking like this because it just replaces ng content with whatever you put in there. If we were to put, a div with a bunch of other stuff, all of that is just going to be placed below. And likewise, if we put ng content above the h1, then all of the content that you put inside as a child would appear above h1. It's basically just saying any child stuff, stick it here. So that's Angular specific. Native Components has the same concept, they just call it slots. And it's currently experimental, but if you want to use them, they work exactly the same as ng content. It's just the custom elements approach of doing the same thing. You have to make sure you're using native view encapsulation. If you're familiar with the Shadow DOM, that's how you get the native browser implementation. If you're not, don't worry about it, just use ng content. And your template would look the same, you just use slot instead of content. And then you would use it in much the same way. You can name your slots. So if you wanted to have multiple ones, you say you had a layout element, you could give it a header, a body, and a footer slot. And then you would basically reference all of them, and they would go into whichever named slot you specify, which can be nice if you wanted to kind of compose your templates in more complicated ways. So why would you want to use Angular elements is probably a good question to ask right now. The main things that they considered them for is easily adding complex functionality to CMS-backed sites. If you guys are using React for not so much as single-page applications, but just as complex components, Angular elements would be a similar thing. So it's kind of moving more into that React space. And then creating dynamic components, so things that are able to talk to each other. And if you're doing any kind of server-side rendering, if you're dealing with Angular Universal, or if SEO is important, it's much easier to drop in one of these than to set up Angular Universal and do server-side rendering. Some of the other use cases for the future is cross-framework compatibility, so there's nothing to stop you from throwing one of these complex elements into a Vue application or a React application or something else in the future. One way they sold it is never have to write a date picker again, because I imagine every application you work on, that's one of the first things you have to do is create some fancy date picker. Yeah, functionality doesn't stay the same. Who cares if it's written in a slightly outdated framework if it just works? And you can throw it into your newer thing. Another nice use case would be if you like the Material look, you can easily create Material themed components using Angular Material and then package them up so anybody could use them. And then they're hoping to be able to make them easier to use with design systems. Some of this is going to be in future versions, but right now you can build these components and use them. Which gets us to browser support. So no surprise here, everybody supports it, but IE Edge. With Firefox, it's currently only in the nightly builds and hidden behind a flag. But if you're using Chrome, Opera, or Safari, any iOS devices, you can play around with these and they'll work without any polyfills. Polyfills are available though, so if you need to support older browsers like IE9, you can still use them. So I figured, since it's my laptop, I get the luxury of being able to actually do a live-ish demo, but kind of following the advice of cooking shows, I did basically all of the work beforehand. So let me switch my screen share. And let's make this something. There we go. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a tour of pre-existing code. It's going to be fun. So you can see here, just like before, we've got our ngDo bootstrap callback where we actually define and register these two custom elements. We've got a color picker and a box component, and each of them are currently just Angular components that we've registered in our module as entry components. And you'll also notice that what we're doing is we're pulling in NGRX. So it's a Redux style store. So the components are actually talking to each other through a store that whoever's implementing this doesn't have to know about. They don't care. All they do is just put these two tags in and they work. So to kind of show some of these components, so we've got our color picker, and all this is just a input of type color. And when someone chooses a color, it dispatches a new event to the NGRX store. Super simple stuff. You'll notice the selector here, I went with EL-color picker, but in the module, I give it a different name. They don't have to be the same selectors. So in order to use this as a native element, you would call it color picker instead of EL-color picker. And then we've got this box component, and this guy's real complicated. What he does is just sets the background color to whatever color the other input chooses. And again, it has a selector of EL box, but in the module, we call it box component. And then in order to get it to work, you actually need to be targeting ES 2015 because it requires the, what's it called? The custom elements.define method expects a class, a constructor function. And so if you target lower versions, it doesn't know how to handle kind of the code that gets created. And then here's the live coding part. So let's see if I can remember this. We've got our color picker and our box component. And you'll notice I'm just in the index HTML file. I'm not inside of Angular. Here's where you would normally put like your app root, but we're not demoing it that way. We're doing it this way. And so if we serve this guy up, so now we've got our box component and our input. So if we choose a color, what's the coolest color anybody can name? 420 dab. And there you go. So these are updating themselves. They're updating each other using Redux store. But for whoever uses it, oops, not that one. Where'd you go? There you go. But whoever uses it, they just have to throw in those two HTML tags. You could add, stuff between them. No, there's space between. Actually, I'm curious. Now we're going off script. What happens if we just add a bunch of these? They should all update, and they do. If we wanted, we could have this component also subscribe to the store so that so they all update their own value. But for now, they're all just dealing with one single value that's shared. Yeah, so that is Angular Elements in a real quick whirlwind. Any questions on that one?
Explain again how the stores work and how they're talking to each other.
Yeah.
I kind of missed that part.
So yeah, let's get into NGRX because we got some extra time. So who here is familiar with Redux? Anybody? Sweet. Okay. So Redux is a basically single source of truth, unidirectional data flow, all those cool buzzwords that I don't know enough to explain, but people seem to like it. So I decided to give it a try for this, even though it's overkill. Basically what you do is you have a JSON object that consists of the current state of the application. So you don't have to, it's a good way of decoupling things. So if you look, our box component doesn't have any reference to the color picker component. All it has a reference to is the store. Likewise, the color picker doesn't have any reference to the box. it also only has access to the store. And so the way Redux style things work is you dispatch actions, and then you have reducer functions that update whatever state they're concerned with based on those actions. So this isn't going to be a great example because there's only one action and reducer. So this is what a reducer looks like. In fact, let me bump up size real quick. Let's go. There we go. That easier to see? Okay. So this is a reducer. It's basically just a giant switch statement. And so what it does is it just, anytime an action is dispatched, it runs through this function. And in a more complex application, you'd have a bunch of reducers. And so this one has an initial state that is just the active color, which is currently nothing. But if we wanted everything to be white to begin with, we would set it that way. So whenever an action is dispatched, every reducer gets called with the current section of state that it's concerned with and the action. And if it doesn't care about any of the action that was dispatched, state stays the same. It returns the same reference, so it's so you're just doing immutable checks. It doesn't actually care. Yeah, it knows that state remained the same. No mutations happen. Otherwise, if it is an action that it cares about, like this set color action, then it updates the active color to whatever the payload of that action was. And so now the state is the current color. And so an action is just a real dumb class that just has a type and then a optional payload of whatever value. The payload can be as complex as you want it to be or as simple. And then this is just kind of the key that's used to check, is this the action I care about? It's just using this key behind the scenes, doing kind of a string comparison. Yeah, so you dispatch actions. So if we go back to our color component, or our color picker, you can see that it dispatches a new set color action, and the payload is the current color, and that just comes from the selected color of the input field.
This is sort of like a replacement for your inputs and outputs that you're normally doing with Angular components talking to each other. This is an alternative way of more, I guess you're separating the concerns. You're not having the dependency of the components. That's kind of the goal of all of this.
Yep, exactly. So you can see these are sibling components. So even if you had inputs and outputs, it would be hard to get them to talk to each other. You would need some kind of service as a middleman. And then, yeah, so the nice thing is we can create other components that also deal with that same slice of state in the store. That was a big piece of spit, thanks. But lost my train of thought. Yeah, so basically anything can interact with the store as it wants. So if we go back to give kind of a idea of how it looks. So this is the Redux dev tools. So you can see these are the actions that have been dispatched. So we've set the color to that, and we updated it again to that value. So this is currently what state looks like. And if we choose a new color, let's go white. You can see a new action is dispatched. State's been updated to white, and all of these are notified of the change and update themselves. So any questions about Redux?
We need a separate round.
Yeah.
Just so you know.
It's
The database needs to know about these values too. How do you handle that? True.
Yeah, so because you're still writing Angular, you can use the HTTP client service. So if you wanted to do, there's a few ways you can do it. The kind of quick and easy way would be in here, we would pull in HTTP client, and then we could do this this.client post endpoint and pass it the active color. And so, yeah, at that point, it would just be updating. Yeah, then there's other ways, more preferred ways to handle it when you're using Redux, using things called effects. And basically, they also listen for actions, but they're only responsible for making HTTP calls. So, anything else? Or any questions about Angular in general? We can bring the whole gang back up. And if not, then I guess it's just food time from here on out.
I had a question. Does slots replace transclusion, or?
It's the custom elements approach of doing it. Yeah, so all browsers will support slots to use, and Angular will support it, or currently supports it as well. But if you're writing custom components in Angular, there's no reason to not just stick with ng content. Yeah, you can name your ng content blocks just like you can name your slots, so you can have multiple in one template. And I'm going to stop sharing, Alan.